We have a way as human beings of mixing up our priorities. We have a way of making the less important things more important and the more important things less important. And nowhere have I seen this more than in church ministry, that conflicts have arisen over very small and petty things, or what has seemed to be small and petty things. In my first pastorate, it was only a couple weeks in where there was a conflict over a clock. A woman had donated all sorts of the materials to renovate the basement of the church, and in renovating it, she had wanted to make sure that the walls stayed pristine and good looking, and so the clock was hung on a wall where it was kind of difficult to see. When another very practically minded woman thought, oh, it's kind of crazy that the clock is on that wall, why don't we move it to this wall? Suddenly there was an enormous offense. And there was this blow up, and there was a threat to leave the church, and there was conflict all over the placement of a clock. And yet it wasn't about the clock. It wasn't about where the clock was placed or if it was on this wall or that wall. It was a matter of one person prioritizing practicality and another person prioritizing the well-being of a brand new fixed lower auditorium. But in our day, we find that there are complex issues, increasingly complex issues, that are being reduced down to sound bites. And in our sound bite age, it's very difficult then to be able to have meaningful conversations. And so what we find is that statues are being torn down of slaveholders, and we're finding that there's all sorts of discussion about that. What's the best way to recognize the history, a very imperfect history of Western civilization, and at the same time also acknowledge that these people who were very instrumental in Western civilization also had deep flaws. We can think about what's the best way to honor people who are black. Do we say all Black Lives Matter, or is there a better or a different way to communicate that? And suddenly we find that there are debates about little words, and then we hear of people who in this social distancing age are having neighbors over, and they feel that they're fully justified in having someone over on their back deck, while others are still feeling like, I need to keep my social distance. I've got to keep at least 6 feet apart, if not further. Or face masks are going to be an issue, as I've even seen on social media, some people thinking, well, you can have your opinion and I can have mine, but then that quickly devolves into, well, everyone should wear face masks, or this is a governmental conspiracy and it's infringing upon my rights. And suddenly small things become massive issues. And they're polarizing. And what we find is that these polarizing issues have become so cantankerous. Now, Paul in the book of Romans, here is the most theological, the greatest doctrinal treatise that Paul writes. 16 chapters. And in chapters 14, beginning at verse 1 to the beginning of 15 to the end at verse 7 there where I read, Paul spends 10% of a doctrinally dense letter on how to get along. Now, if that isn't instructive to us, that it's not sufficient just to talk about doctrine, but then we have to drive that doctrine down into practice. We need to hear Paul recognizing that there are racial tensions between Jew and Gentile. Should we worship on the Sabbath, or is every day the same? Can we eat meat or just vegetables? What about wine? Or should we partake of wine or should we abstain? And suddenly there are these differing opinions about things that they seem petty and small to us. And yet we live in a world that is finding that we have our priorities constantly mixed up. And this is the problem with us as human beings. We struggle to get our priorities right. We struggle to have them aligned properly. And so what we can find is that all sorts of priorities get twisted and turned around. And so what I want to do this morning is I want to first look at one reminder, I want to look at 2 cautions, and then I want to look at 3 people. One reminder. And that reminder is at the very beginning and at the very end, where Paul says, welcome one another. He says that in 14 verse 1, and then he says that again in chapter 15 verse 7. And so it's the bookends, if you would. Welcome one another. And he gives a context as to how we're to welcome one another. Welcome one another just as Christ did, as Christ did to the glory of God, he'll say in chapter 15 verse 7. And so the model, the example, is of Christ who welcomed us. Because we have a tendency to make things blown out of proportion that are actually small, and take big things that should be large and reduce them down to nothing at all, Paul wants to make sure that we don't lose the weightier matters of the law, nor do we lose the weightier matters of God himself. Now, the weightier matters of the law are very simple. Love God and love others. This is how all of the law can be summed up with these two commands. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. But this challenge of loving one another, Paul sees that this could be the threat to the unity of the church in Rome. And so he makes it very practical. He says, welcome one another, or receive one another. The intention is the same. Have open arms. Be ready to embrace. Now, Paul's not aiming for uniformity. He's not expecting that everybody is going to think the same. But he recognizes that we need to keep the important things the important things. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. Jesus, even in his ministry, he would challenge the Pharisees. In Matthew 23, verse 23, Jesus says a woe to the Pharisees. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You tithe on your dill and your cumin. You go to the spice cupboard, and you get 10% of that, and you measure it out, and you take that, and you offer that as your offering to God. But in the meantime, you forget the weightier matters like faithfulness and justice. Not taking care of your family. You're not regarding those who are in need. And here you are sacrificing your spices when you should be using those spices to care for those whom you love. But this is the problem, that we forget what is most important, that we tend to focus on what's right. And because we focus on what's right, therefore, our rightness becomes predominant. When Paul says what ought to be predominant is welcoming one another. The reason we welcome one another is because Christ welcomed us. As Paul can say in Romans 5, verses 6, 7, and 8, that when we were yet sinners, when we were enemies of God, when we were strangers, when we were weak, Christ died for us. God welcomed us. He didn't wait for us to have the same opinions as him. He didn't wait for us to get our ducks in a row and to get our lives all fixed up. No, he welcomed us when we were a mess of priorities, when we were making a big deal about a little things and making a little deal about big things. That's when he sent his son. And in days like today, these have been very hard days. There have been kids who have been slaving away at school, and they've been trying their best, trying to make school work. Some finding that online education is not at all for them, while some are just surging ahead, though it's less than ideal. Some families trying to juggle work schedules and home life, trying to help kids with schooling, and feeling like I just can't ever do it all. Then you've got businesses that are trying to reopen and trying to maintain social distancing with customers while they've faced one of the hardest economic times ever that they have experienced. A sudden shutdown, no cash flow. And then suddenly we're having to stand in lines, or we're finding that it's not as convenient as what it used to be. And for most of us, we're trying to be patient. And then there's church reopening. And some churches have already reopened. Some are in the process of reopening. And it feels kind of awkward. The big thing in all of these things, that Paul wants us to have a humility about is let's outdo one another by welcoming one another. This was Jesus' command to his disciples. By this, all men will know that you're my disciples, by your love for one another. It's not in all of the other details. It's in how do you embrace one another? Is there a reluctance or is there a joyfulness? And so the first reminder, the one reminder is welcome one another. Then there's two cautions that I want to highlight from this passage that Paul has. He says he wants to caution us not to despise one another and not to have uniformity with one another, or to think we ought to have uniformity with one another. First, he tells us not to despise one another. And in verse 3, he says these words. He says, "Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats." Or verse 10, "Why do you pass judgment on your brother?" Or, "Why do you despise your brother?" And so here is a temptation, the temptation that exists. So I have my opinion, and I feel very strongly about my opinion, but you have a different opinion. And what do I do when your opinion and my opinion are different? In our world, there is this hostility that exists, that if you don't agree with me, I have the right to hate you, that I have the right to disdain you. And this actually is going to be the great fracture point of our culture, that people are so entrenched in their rightness that unless you think like me, I have the right to despise you. Now, it's a good thing that God is not like that, because I certainly don't have all of the thoughts of my thoughts aligning with God, and he could easily despise me. But he doesn't. We live in a day of outrage, and outrage is the acceptable way to express your dissent. So even this week, we saw in our parliament, our federal parliament, when a discussion came up about systemic racism, when there were questions about the definition, then suddenly there was this piling on. That in fact, one member of parliament stated that if you don't support a bill condemning systemic racism, even though it hasn't been fully defined or that not all parties understand it in the same way, you're a racist. Now, how have we gone from I disagree with you to you're a racist in just like that? Now, definitely there are issues that we need to sort through in terms of the systems of how our country has been built upon and what the implications are. But for us, the point I'm making is for us to quickly move from I disagree with you to I despise you is a dangerous one. It's an incredibly dangerous one. This is not the way that God is towards his people. He doesn't wait for us to be fully aligned with him and despise us until we are. The fact is that Romans 2:4 says that don't you know that it's God's kindness that leads you to repentance? That what broke down our hearts of hardness and our hostility, and what changes anyone's heart and mind is never harshness, never despising, but it is a kindness. And so Paul can first say, don't despise one another. But the second thing that Paul says is, he doesn't say, come on guys, get on the same page. You all need to agree with one another. And you see how he says in these verses, verse 5, one person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. So Paul, are you going to take a side? No, he goes on and he says, each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. So Paul doesn't say, okay, you people who believe that we should continue to worship on the Sabbath, that's been your Jewish practice, You don't understand. You don't understand the Bible. We need to get you aligned that all days are alike. Christ has fulfilled the Sabbath, and so therefore you guys are wrong. He doesn't call for uniformity. He says, no, in the midst of the disagreements, understand that people are at different places in their consciences. And that because of their conscience, they don't have the liberty that some people have. Some people have more restricted liberty, and others have greater liberty. And so respect that fact. And the principle that we need then is, as Paul can go on to say in this passage, is that we ought to die to ourselves. That we ought to welcome one another, and that we ought not to create a stumbling block for those who have a conscience that is more constrained, more tight. And so we are working towards aligning our priorities and our convictions with what the Scriptures say, but I bet there's about 40 people in this room here this morning, for those of you who are watching at home. I could probably ask the 40 people here in this room about, has anybody ever had a conviction that goes beyond what the Bible has clearly said? And every hand probably would have to go up, because none of us have perfectly aligned our consciences to the Word of God. But we want to become increasingly sensitive to what God has said. And so that doesn't mean that we despise one another, and it doesn't mean that we have uniformity. In fact, by having differing opinions on secondary issues, so we're not talking about salvation, we're not talking about Christ's death for sinners, we're not talking about a triune God, we're talking about these secondary matters. We don't expect uniformity. And the reason we don't expect uniformity is that by our differences, we are actually going to help one another to love one another. It's going to sanctify us. It's going to sharpen us. It's going to clarify our thinking. And it's going to make us more like Jesus Christ. And so, one reminder, welcome one another. 2 cautions. Don't despise one another and don't expect uniformity. Now, 3 people. Well, the first person I want to point out is, I'll call him Weak Wes. Weak Wes, he thinks that we should all wear face masks, and he is fully convinced that we should all be wearing face masks. It's absolute necessity. Now, he's not a legalist. He doesn't think, oh, if you don't wear a face mask as a Christian, you're not saved. But rather, he is fully convinced in his own mind that everyone should be wearing a face mask. Now, why is he considered weak? He's not weak because he's unsure. Do you see that in this passage? He says in verses 2 and 3, one person believes he may eat anything while another person eats only vegetables. Here is a person with strong conviction. So when we're talking about weak Wes, we're not talking about the fact that when he's weak in faith, as Paul will talk about it, Paul does not mean that his convictions are always wavering because he's doubting. That's not the issue here. Rather, that he's got a more constrained conscience. He has a very tight conscience, and he's not a legalist because he's not saying you must do this to be a believer. So let's make that clear. But he goes beyond what the Bible says clearly, and because of that, he has a limited understanding of the principles of Scripture. But do you notice what Paul says about weak Wes in verse 4? Is there a problem with his faith? Well, Paul says in verse 4, "Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand." But the problem that weak Wes struggles with is that he has to let everyone know his opinions. So this is what the person who is weak in faith tends to do. They're all over social media. They tell everyone what they think about racism, about the statues being torn down, about coronavirus. Their opinions are strong and clear. But when you begin to engage in anything with them, it's as though you've immediately run into this conflict. That they're debating. Paul makes that clear, that Paul says in verse 1, don't quarrel over opinions. This is the nature of the person who is weak in faith, as Paul can say. And the nature of a person who is always expressing with strength the dogmatic opinions that they have that go well beyond the Bible is that they're just unpleasant to be around. You don't want to spend time with them. They are annoying. You don't even want to get together because the minute you get together, you know that the next debate is going to come up. Well, in contrast to Weak Wes, the second person is Strong Sally, I'll call her. Now, Strong Sally, she also has very strong opinions as well. And in fact, she looks a lot like Weak Wes. Do you see that in verse 6? The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats, eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains, abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. Do you notice that Weak Wes is seeking to honor God, do it by faith, love the Lord as God? And Strong Sally is seeking to honor God and obey God and to fully comply with what God has said. There's no difference there. There's no difference between being strong or being weak. Rather, Strong Sally has this great sense of liberty. Yeah, we can wear a face mask, but I don't really feel the need to. And the danger that Strong Sally has is that she feels like she can have her liberties and flaunt it. Oh, I don't need to wear a face mask. When they tell me to put it on, I don't need to put it on. I am going to enjoy my liberties. Now, let me make it abundantly clear that when Paul talks about being strong or being weak, he is not talking about there is mature or immature. This is not a question of maturity. In fact, a person could be very strong. They could have a liberated conscience and be very immature in faith. And a person who is weak in faith could be very mature. So this is not a question of a strength or of maturity. Because you might be right that you have lots of liberty but behave wrongly, and that is immaturity. What Paul says is that the strong person ought to give up their rights. Maturity does not mean I know more. It means I love more. And that's the principle that is needed for both the weak and for the strong. And so there's Weak Wes, there's Strong Sally. Who's the third person? It's a gracious God. And I want you to hear this loudly and clearly about the nature of our God. Our weak and imperfect obedience is not disobedience. You see that in verse 23, where Paul can say, he says, but whoever has doubts is condemned if he eats, because the eating is not from faith. That's not the problem of the person who is weak or the person who is strong. It's the person who violates their conscience. And the way that we can move forward is that by recognizing that both the weak and the strong person have faith, what we can do is we can welcome one another. And as we welcome one another, we can avoid some very typical temptations. So for the person who tends to be more conservative in their practice, let's say, we tend to worry about them. Oh my goodness, they're going to slide off into legalism. What's going to happen? They're going to make a shipwreck of the faith because they're so tight, they're going to fall into legalism. Or the person who's maybe a little bit more liberal in their conscience, we think, oh my goodness, they're going to fall into license. But what does Paul say about both the weak and the strong? We go back to verse 4. It's God who enables them to stand. The fact that we gather together and we have differing opinions and that we can love one another, that some are more conservative, and I'm not talking politically, I'm talking about our consciences, that some are more conservative and some are more liberal. The fact is that God is able to keep them from falling. Verse 4, God will enable them to stand. And when God saved us, our convictions were not in right proportion. And He has been working in us, and one of the ways He works in us is by a humility of us having these differing opinions, whether it's environmentalism or whether it's about our economic beliefs, whether it's about our practices during this COVID season. God sees our obedience, even our imperfect obedience. And what does He do? He keeps us. And He welcomes us. So then what should that mean for you and me? As Paul can say, we don't live for ourselves and we don't die for ourselves. So we ought to be dying for one another. We ought to be welcoming one another. And we ought to be doing everything possible so that we don't cause one another to stumble. Church, this is our hour to shine and to show that we do welcome one another, that we love one another, and that God has been gracious to us. This is our mission that Jesus has given to us